Welcome back, Mando.
Greetings once again, Bucketheads. Mevar Tagar. Welcome to our 274th Droidalicious episode of Mandovision. I am your host, Nargai Tom, and thank you so much for checking out this small, independent Star Wars podcast. We're so glad you're here. Reach out to us on the socials. We're at Mando_Vision on Twitter/X and Instagram. You can email the show, mandovisiontom@gmail.com. Be sure to like, subscribe, follow, and share this show with all the Mandalorians in your covert. All right, Bucketheads, we are back. We are resuming what we had started previously, which is our rewatch of Star Wars Rebels. Last week was dark times with the passing of James Earl Jones, and that took up a lot of bandwidth on our radars, and in regards to that episode, I got a lot of really nice feedback from people who checked it out and who appreciated it. And I did want to tell you all what I told them. I did blow it. I really would have loved to have mentioned the Sandlot in that episode. And for some reason, it just slipped through the cracks. Or, never mind. We're not going to go there. But yeah, the Sandlot, another great role. James Earl Jones bringing the thunder, bringing that gravitas that he does to another great movie from my youth. Anyways, we are here to talk about Star Wars Rebels, and again, things are unclear on how you want to view this episode number. By all accounts, it's episode 2. On some accounts, it's episode 3. This first season is going to annoy me because of that the lack of clarity on what's what with these episodes. I know, according to the IMDb, this is episode 3. According to Disney Plus, when you pull it up, it is episode 2. So that's going to make me a bit insane. I'm sorry, I think I said that in reverse. I think it's episode 3 on Disney Plus and then episode 2 on IMDb. So, I don't know. We'll just go with it. We're just gonna roll with what we can. And if you guys have any thoughts on how to clarify what should be like galactic standard for the episode numbers in this first season, I'll take all suggestions, friends. I truly would. So let's go ahead. There's not a lot of Star Wars news to get to. We're in the beginning of the fall season right now. This is a good time for us to focus on Star Wars Rebels. There will be some episodes in the future of some supplemental content. There are some Star Wars comics I want to talk about. There's a big transition coming up in Marvel's publishing scheme for Star Wars comics as they conclude the time period between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. So we'll talk about that as they wrap that up. Just some hints into my thought process on what's going on with those comic books. Man, did they attempt to squeeze a lot of story in between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. Was it all good? Was it all bad? We'll talk about that down the road. All right, friends, but let's go ahead, get the episode particulars out of the way for this episode of Star Wars Rebels, because we are talking about Star Wars Rebels, Season 1, Episode 2, or 3, Droids in Distress. The original air date was October 13th, 2014. Written by Kevin Hobbs, directed by Stephen G. Lee. Our primary cast for this episode, we have Taylor Gray as Ezra Bridger, Vanessa Marshall as Harrison Dula, Freddie Prinze Jr. as Kanan Jarrus, Tia Shakar as Sabine Wren, Steve Blum as Zeb, Dave Filoni's Chopper, David Oyelowo is Callus, Agent Callus, if you will. Phil Lamar as Bail Organa. Anthony Daniels as C-3PO. Kath Soucie as Minister Maketh Tua. And Paul Rubens, the late great Paul Rubens, as RX-24. Ooh, and I skipped over Keith Zarabagia as Vizago. There you go. But yes, a very talented voice cast in this week's episode. Our primary plot for this week: the crew of the Ghost are running low on supplies and cash, so they take on a mission to transport weapons, where they run into some familiar droids. Familiar to us, friends, not familiar to the crew of the Ghost. And it's always welcome to have C-3PO and R2-D2 on screen. Again, particularly in this period of their history where we know they were left with Bail Organa, but what's going on? What's happening with the droids? And that is the great conundrum of many of Star Wars characters in this era, in the Skywalker saga. Where do these characters all go? And I couldn't help but think of that again. We talked about Ahsoka and Sabine. I can't help but think of Cal Kestis. I can't help but thinking of Ezra Bridger. And now that he is back in the galaxy, where is he during the Rise of Skywalker? These are all things that, gosh, I'd love to get some answers and clarity to. But Star Wars, as it exists now at Disney, seems to enjoy trying, and sometimes stumbling in its efforts to dance around the raindrops of the original trilogy. So we'll just have to wait and see on that front. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole necessarily. I don't think it's constructive to what we're here to talk about, which is an episode of Rebels. An episode that I actually liked quite a bit. It's got a little bit of everything in it that we will grow to know about for this show. The way in which the crew operates, the bonds that begin to forge between Ezra and the other characters, the other people of the other crew members of the Ghost, the other Spectres, if you will. So there's a lot of really, really good stuff here. I still think the animation's a bit unrefined compared to where it will end up. But, I think that's just sort of like the growing pains that go along with some of these shows. So I don't count that as a negative in regards to anything like that. Because by and large, all the storytelling issues that are in those first two seasons of Star Wars: The Clone Wars are pretty much resolved. This is a show that is pretty well thought out and planned for and mapped out. Now, that's not to say there aren't going to be some ups and downs in this first season. My recollection is that there were quite a few in this first season, but we'll get to those. I don't think this episode is one of them. I think this is a really solid episode of getting to know a little bit more about some of our characters, some of their dynamics within the family bonds of the Ghost. And again, we get a little hint of what R2 and 3PO are up to with Bail Organa and sort of the fomenting rebellion that's sort of brewing in the background of the galaxy at this time period. So let's get into this episode. And you know what that means. It's time. Strap on your buckets. Let's go.
Get out of here. We'll hold them off.
You're going to have to relocate the covert.
This is the way.
This is the way.
So the episode starts off in a lot of action. We have the Ghost being pursued by Imperials, a Star Destroyer in hot pursuit. Kanan in the gunwell, and launching into hyperspace. But they don't get the supplies they were looking for. They don't hijack the cargo they intended to get. And we find out that the crew of the Ghost is in a bit of dire straits. No funds, no fuel, running low on a little bit of everything. So, of course, they have to go back to a job for Vizago, who we met in the two-part pilot, something of an arms dealer. But the way that Kanan looks at it is that they're keeping arms out of the Imperials' hands. And I think maybe in his mind he's hoping that the weapons are being redistributed to those fighting against the Empire, but that's probably an optimistic appraisal of the situation. Vizago could be selling to terrorists of any sort, going against the local governments, local regimes, people that are sort of warding off the Empire in a sense. Or Vizago would just be cutting a deal and selling them back to the Empire for a profit of his own. It's really hard to say at this point in the series where we're going to go with that element of it. But Zeb is the one who speaks up first and foremost with his reservations of getting involved in arms dealing. And that sort of becomes our through line for this episode, because when it's revealed what kind of weapons they are stealing from the Empire, it has a very personal connection to Zeb and his people, the Lasats, and what happened to them on their homeworld of Lasan. And we find out that Agent Callus was directly involved in that. So this episode has a lot of really great background for Zeb, for Callus. And one of the things that it made me remember or maybe ponder a little bit more closely, because, again, knowing where these characters will go, there are certain details in Callus's story that I do not recall, but knowing where his endpoint is, I'm really intrigued to see how it goes, particularly in this episode where he seems to be very gung-ho on ending Zeb and taking the life of another Lasat. So that's of interest in this episode. But let's back up. Let's go to the very beginning here. After they decide to go to work for Vizago, and they go to Garel, and they're kind of pulling a scam. They're infiltrating this ship, being piloted by the droid from Star Tours, which is a very cool nod to Star Tours. I like the sort of Ocean's 11 aspect of like this kind of con they're pulling on the Imperial agent and the Aqualish ambassador to get information. We see R2 and C-3PO, Chopper and Ezra stage a diversion to get them kicked out of the main cabin into the back. Droid segregation, droids not welcome in the front of the cabin. Droid racism on full effect in the age of the Empire. I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised at all, friends. But we get the information. We understand that this Aqualish has weapons that he's trying to sell to the Imperials. And these are the weapons. These T-17 rifles are the weapons that killed so many Lasats, the people of Zeb, and were instrumental in clearing their homeworld, Lasan, of their people, employed by the Imperials. So when this revelation happens, everything becomes very, very personal to Zeb, and I think we can all understand that. And this is sort of our first glimpse of seeing behind the curtains of Zeb. When we meet him in the first episode, whether you want to consider it the first single episode or the first two-parter episode, that's up to you. But he's sort of like the muscle. He's the brute. He's the goon. He's there to Wreck-It Ralph, if you will. Now we get a little glimpse back into and start to see and learn a little bit more about the Lasats themselves, and maybe why we haven't seen them so much in the Star Wars galaxy to this point, because the Empire wages a war of genocide against them. And we'll get to more of those details as the show goes on, as Callus's role is revealed, as Zeb's part in all of it is revealed. But right now we're just kind of getting that first taste of what's going on with the Lasats and Callus and his role in their I want to say fate, but I don't think it's quite the right word for that. But a lot of neat stuff coming up down the road. We will get to it. I promise we will. But for right now, Callus just seems like he's hell-bent on making sure that Zeb joins the other Lasats that he sent to their deaths. But we'll talk about that down the road. Again, Callus has a different fate in store than maybe what we think at this point, which makes him very, very interesting. As I mentioned before, R2-D2, C-3PO in this episode, and we get what I think is a really cool encounter, which is I believe to be the first encounter between R2D2 and Chopper, a relationship that is developed a little bit more in the comics in recent years. But I believe this is their first encounter together on the animated spectrum in the series. Two astromechs going at it with very distinct personalities, very big personalities. So they're somewhat in conflict with each other. Obviously, Chopper is attempting to do what he needs to do for his mission, but surprise, surprise, we find out that R2D2 is on a mission of his own, and ultimately their missions do end up aligning. But it's fun to see them kind of bicker with each other in binary fashion in the early parts of this episode. If there's one glitch in this episode for me, it's the fact that like C-3PO becomes sort of like the instrument that keeps the Empire involved in everything. He is the one who makes a distress call to the Empire that he's been abducted by criminals, by outlaws, by hooligans. And it's him who makes the call to Callus that they have to come and rescue him on Lothal with the weapons that these outlaws had stolen from Garel. So I wasn't crazy about that, and luckily the crew of the Spectre seems to be very, 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 very forgiving of droids who have ratted them out to the Empire, because I think any one of the Spectres would be totally justified in blasting C-3PO into a million pieces and leaving him behind for dead. But it is what it is. And that leads ultimately to our confrontation on Lothal between Agent Callus and Zeb, where we get a little bit more background information on Callus and his role, his history with the Lasats. And we learn a bit more about the Lasat people, a species that's brand new to us in 2014 that we don't know anything about. Zeb talks about the honor guard of Lasan and the bow rifles that they carry, and how Callus has taken one from a fallen member of that group of elite warriors, and their combat is awesome. It's great animation, it's great action, but the stakes are insanely personal to Zeb, and you can feel that with every blow that's delivered. And again, I can't wait till we get to the episodes a little bit further down, where we get a little bit deeper understanding into Callus, because it seems like he's ready to deliver the death blow to Zeb, but he does pause for a moment, and I think that's where we have to sort of collect our thoughts and put a kind of a pin in this conversation, because maybe things aren't quite as clear-cut as we think they are. Again, we'll go back to this. There may be elements to the series that I'm forgetting. It has been quite some time since I watched it the first time around. But it's a really strong episode of the show, of this beginning period, because again, it looks like Callus is going to deliver that death blow, and it's Ezra who steps up and is beginning to kind of feel the Force, and maybe he can't control it, but he's able to use it, and he does a big, massive Force push, sending Callus up against a rock, saving Zeb's life. And again, earlier in the episode, we see Ezra doing big jumps and seemingly having the Force as his ally as he springs across the rooftops of Garel. And again, it seems like Ezra can touch the Force, but he's not quite in control of it. Kanan has not started formal Jedi training with him yet, but the actions on Lothal, saving Zeb, this spurs Kanan into one of the last things they say in the episode is, your formal Jedi training begins tomorrow. And they say this in front of R2 and C-3PO, who, again, have lived through the Clone Wars, spent many a time with Jedis, knows many of their ways. And ultimately, we step back and we find out that, surprise, surprise, R2 on a mission for Bail Organa. He has recorded everything, and now Bail is beginning to document just who these rebels might be and if they're helpful to any causes he may have. And again, I think this is a wonderful little start of the rebellion in a very noble and heroic sense. It's not the down and dirty versions that we got from in Andor, but kind of more in line with the more noble aspects of the rebellion that the original trilogy gave us. Maybe it's a little bit more of a romanticized version of it. Maybe it's less of a down and dirty, gritty version of it, which might be more in line with reality. But it's still fun, and it's still kind of fun to see the beginning of these sort of independent cells that are doing what they can against the Empire, beginning to come together, and how people like Bail Organa are trying to bring these forces together to stand up to the Empire. So, again, all in all, it's a very enjoyable episode. I love the peek we got behind the curtain with learning a little bit more about Zeb and his people, the Lasats, their fate, the fate of the planet Lasan. A little bit more of the background on Callus, because at this point, Callus is our main bad guy. They've teased Inquisitors, but other than a quick glimpse of the Grand Inquisitor, we haven't seen much of them yet at this point. And again, Callus has seen that Kanan is a Jedi Knight, and it didn't slow him down this episode. But now he knows that Ezra is probably one as well, and I think that confirms his suspicions from the first episode, anyways. But in that regards, it lacks a little bit of sort of linear continuity, but it's okay. It's not a super big deal yet. Callus has a history with this group of rebels, so it would stand to reason that maybe the Inquisitores is not quite involved just yet. They're maybe doing some work of their own, but they are coming. And I guess that's the sort of thing to remember at this point of the Star Wars history, this dark period between episodes 3 and episode 4. And there is no New Hope just yet, though Kanan clearly believes, from what Obi-Wan said in the holocron message that he kept for all these years, that maybe Ezra is the hope that brings the Jedi back to the galaxy. Anyways, a rock solid episode of Star Wars Rebels. I give it 7.5 buckets. Mostly for the Lasat information we get in the background. But it pushes our story forward. It pushes our characters forward. And again, we start to see those bonds, those connections, the family dynamic that really drives this series begins to come out in this one. We begin to understand a little bit more about why these characters are together. And that's going to be a lot of this episode is understanding the dynamic of what brought these characters together and what motivates them to fight against the Empire. So, again, 7.5 buckets, a really solid episode of the show. Loved having the droids back. I'm a big droid fan, so anything with them is great. And again, just a really solid outing as far as getting to know who the people in this show are. And that's it. And that's the episode, my friends. This is Mandovision, and I am your host, Nargai Tom. Thank you for checking out our small independent Star Wars podcast. Reach out to us on the socials at Mando_Vision on Twitter /X and Instagram. Email the show, mandovisiontom@gmail.com. Make sure to like, subscribe, follow, and share the show with all the Mandalorians in your covert. If you're so inclined, sweet 5-star reviews really help the small independent shows like us stand out, not get lost in the shuffle. So we appreciate anyone who takes the time to do that. All right, friends, barring any big major Star Wars news, we'll be back next week to talk about another episode of Star Wars Rebels, or maybe we'll talk about Star Wars comics. Anything could happen. It's a free-for-all right now until Skeleton Crew. That's all I'm going to say. All right, Bucketheads, go out there. Be great Star Wars fans. Be kind, supportive, understanding, nurturing support as Star Wars fans, even to those who disagree. And we don't all have to share the same opinion, as long as we have a nice, healthy dialogue and a healthy respect for each other's opinions. All right, Bucketheads, we'll be back. We'll talk next week. Take care of yourselves. And remember, this podcast can only end one way. This is the way.
This is the way.
This is the way.
This is the way.